It was always my hope to have Professor Caroline Barron to talk to us this year. I asked, she said yes, and so here we are. I did want to do medieval London. I don't think there's a bigger reputation person for that than Professor Barron. And the thing about medieval history, I did medieval history, ancient medieval myself, coincidentally at Royal Holloway, although unfortunately we never met. I wasn't fortunate enough to have Caroline as one of my tutors. But there you go. Is medieval history neglected? I don't think it is, but it is possibly the poor relation in general. But when it comes to the context of the City of London, there can't be anything more important than its medieval history, that's for sure. So when I first met Professor Barron for a meeting, what should we do? She suggested, well, it's the 600th anniversary of Agnincourt. Why don't we talk about Henry V and his relationship with the City of London? And perfect. So I think we'll see how important the relationship is, or how important medieval history is with the City of London by the end of this talk, if we're not already aware of that. So it's my great privilege and honor to introduce you Professor Caroline Barron.
Well, thank you, Mike, for that introduction. I'm very glad to meet people who call themselves London historians. We are a special group. I should tell you that Mike could have had an option at Royal Holloway of doing some London history, but he didn't do it then. He came to it later. I'd also like to thank Valerie. I'm sorry she's not here. I thought that was a very fascinating introduction to this history of this building and of Thomas Gresham himself. And as we drank to Her Majesty the Queen, I thought, since she now is our longest reigning sovereign, I had a thought that maybe Henry V was our shortest reigning sovereign, but of course that's wrong. I looked at my list of handbook of dates, and I thought I'd just fill us in on that before we come on to Henry V. You all know, of course, that he isn't the shortest reigning sovereign. He reigned for 10 years, but let me tell you who reigned for shorter periods. Edward VIII advocated within a year, as you know, and Edward V, the one of the princes in the Tower, only was king for a few months. So then we have Richard III, who only lasted for 3 years. I've often thought that the fascination of Richard III is because he had such a short reign, you can mostly find out everything about it in a short time. Then there's James II, who reigned for 4 years, Mary Tudor, who reigned for 6 years, Edward VI for 7 years, along with William IV, and then we have the people who reigned for 10 years, Henry V, Richard I, Coeur de Lion, and Edward VII. Very different people. Anyway, I just thought we should start by I somehow thought one of the things about Henry V is that it was a very short reign. Not as short as some of those, but pretty short, and what he achieved in that time is quite remarkable. And I want to talk to you about Henry V and London, not surprisingly. Of course, what we know about Henry V is his great victory at Agnincourt and his conquest of a great part of northern France. But perhaps the role of London in that conquest hasn't been sufficiently explored. And I want to suggest to you, one of the things that is striking is that Henry V took great trouble to woo the City of London. He used all the sort of flattery and deviousness and indeed veiled threats. And it reminded me, and those of you may remember this, of Winston Churchill's efforts to draw President Roosevelt and the United States into the coalition against Germany in the early years of the Second World War. Now, of course, Henry V had more control over London than Churchill had over the President of the United States of America, but the situation faced by Henry V and by Churchill, those situations were quite similar in that both could only hope for victory in a European war if they had help from a wealthy ally. In the case of Churchill, America. In the case of Henry V, London. Now, Henry V certainly succeeded in creating a special relationship with the City of London, but, of course, as with the later special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, it was not without its strains. Henry's special relationship, however, needs, I think, to be seen in the context of what I would call the normal relations of the sovereign and the city, London and the Crown. You see, on the one hand, you have the sovereign, the king, who needs the city to provide short-term finance to bridge the gap when royal government was experiencing cash flow difficulties. The thing is, the royal sources of revenue were quite sufficient, but they took a long time to collect. And so the king needed short-term finance. He needed the City of London to provide that. It was also London that was able to supply the necessary goods, luxury goods, to furnish an opulent and splendid royal household, and the armour and weapons necessary to equip a fighting force. It was London that could lay on, as now actually, impressive pageants and royal welcomes for coronations and greetings for foreign visitors. As you know, foreign visitors are often entertained by the Lord Mayor of the Guildhall of London. That's a tradition that goes right back to the medieval period. Now, so that's what the Crown needs from London. On the other side, the Londoners only enjoyed their right of self-government, that is, their right to elect their mayor, to elect their own sheriffs and so on, at the pleasure of the monarch. He could withdraw that privilege if he chose to do so. And if the city became lawless or faction-ridden, the king could intervene, as indeed Richard II had recently done in 1392. He withdrew the city's cherished privileges and ran the city himself independently. He ran it for a year. And it cost the city £30,000, a lot of money, to get back their privileges. So there was a balanced relationship between the Crown and the city, an interdependence between the two. What is novel about the relationship of Henry V with the city is the manner in which Henry V chose to conduct that relationship. Now, if you think of Richard II, I mean, Shakespeare's play is not far from the truth, I think, in many respects. Richard II chose to separate himself from his subjects and to stand apart, if you like, from the cut and thrust of ordinary political life. By contrast, Henry V chose to make himself accessible, both to his commanders in the field and to his subjects at home. So he had a very different style of kingship, which may be, of course, something to do with the way he was brought up. As we know, he wasn't brought up to be king. He was the son of Henry IV, who wasn't originally going to be king of England. And, of course, there are those stories about his, playing around in the taverns of Cheapside, as we know, and Falstaff and all that, which has some basis in truth, I think. But the most striking manifestation of this special relationship, of this accessibility, is the series of letters which Henry V wrote to the mayor and aldermen and commons of London while he was away on campaign in France. Now, I mean, that may sound quite obvious to send bulletins home, but it was novel. And although the earliest letter, which Henry wrote, which the earliest one we have surviving, was on the 22nd of September 1415, so just before Agnincourt, he wrote it to the mayor and aldermen and announced to them the surrender of the important port of Harfleur. That was the first part of his campaign, was to capture Harfleur, and then he would move on, hope to capture more or to conquer more of France. That first letter, which he wrote, was written in French. But all the surviving letters, subsequent, and there are 7 that survive in all, were written in English. And that may seem obvious to you, but that was a novelty for the monarch, for the royal government, to use English. The normal languages were Latin and, of course, French. And these letters have survived, not because they were copied in the Royal Chancery, but because they were copied into the city's own records, the City of London's what are called letter books, where they recorded important documents and decisions. And this particular one is known as Letter Book I, which covers the reign of Henry V. And it's clear that there are other letters to which reference is made, but they don't happen to have survived. And it seems likely that it was in the developing office of the Common Clerk, which is the town clerk of London, at the time a man called John Marchant, but he was succeeded by a more famous man called John Carpenter, who was a very notable scholar, learned person, had a great influence on the development of London bureaucracy, if you like, in the early 15th century. Anyway, I think what happened is that Carpenter, new in the office, drafted the responses which went back to Henry V in France, and he wrote them also in English. But they are, compared with the king's letters, which are very terse and to the point, and, I've captured Harfleur and my baggage train has been destroyed, so please send some help, that kind of thing. The city wrote these very overblown, long missives back to him. And 6 of these responses have been preserved, probably by Carpenter himself, who wrote them into the letter book, I'm sure, because he was proud of them. And they're characterized by Kirby, the historian, as groveling. And he dismissed one letter as saying, it says nothing in 500 words of abject flattery. And I think it's probably doubtful that Henry V, in the midst of his campaigns in France, had time to read all John Carpenter's extended prose. But it is possible, and I think it's probable, that the new clerk was trying to show off his skills. But having said all that, I think the letters did serve an important purpose, that is, the responses which Carpenter wrote. Because they assured the king that the city was in, I quote, as great peace and tranquility as ever did city in absence of his most sovereign and excellent lord. Now, although Henry may not have had time to read all this verbose flattery, there's a lot of it, he did need to know that there was peace and quiet on the home front. And again, I don't know if you've seen that book, The Diaries of John Colville, who was Churchill's private secretary in the Second World War. And Colville shows, in writing about that actually Churchill's first concern when he woke up in the morning was how were the towns responding to the bombing? How was the home front holding up? Because if the home front doesn't hold up, the armies abroad can't succeed. And I think, therefore, although these letters are full of flattery, Henry did want to know that the home front, his city of London, was in peace and tranquility. And remember, too, that at this period, England had had not only, of course, the deposition of Richard II and so on, the slightly insecure Lancastrian regime. Richard, Earl of Cambridge, on the eve of the Battle of Agnincourt, the departure for France, had a plot to depose Henry. There was Lollardy and the sort of unrest in religion. So there were reasons for Henry to be worried that maybe the home front would not be peaceable and secure. Interestingly, none of these letters ask directly for money. And there are other routes by which the king did that. I'll come on to that. But of course, Henry did need money for his plans to invade France. And what he did before he left for France in July 1415, on the 10th of March 1415, he summoned the substantial commoners of London, led by their mayor, a man called Thomas Falkender, who was a mercer, and he summoned them to the Tower of London. The map, you were going to kindly move the map across for me? Never mind, doesn't matter. Never mind. Well, you can all see the map. The Tower of London is in the bottom right-hand corner. The Tower, anyway, he summoned them to the Tower because the Tower was not officially within the City of London. It was royal territory within the city. So he summons them to the Tower, and he lays out and he explains to them his plans. He tells them what he's doing, and then he says, now I'd like you to go away and think how much you can contribute. And 4 days later, 5 of the king's councillors, the most high-powered members of his royal council, that was Henry Chichely, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry Beaufort, who was Bishop of Winchester, the king's half-brother, the king's 2 brothers, John, Duke of Bedford, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and his cousin, Edward, Duke of York, all came to London to the Guildhall to hear what the Londoners proposed. And this again is written, the account of this meeting is written in great detail in the city's letter book, again, probably again by Carpenter. And what he does is he gives a great deal of detail about who sat where and whether the Mayor of London had precedence and so on. He doesn't actually tell us what the outcome was. He doesn't tell us whether they actually agreed to lend any money or not. However, we know from the Exchequer, Royal Exchequer accounts, that the city did indeed agree to lend the enormous sum of 10,000 marks. A mark is 13 shillings and fourpence, that is 2/3 of a pound. So what they were lending was £6,666, 13 and fourpence. And as security for this massive loan, I mean, when you think that the king's annual income was £34,000, that's a pretty large sum. The Londoners were given as security a magnificent collar or chain of gold, encrusted with jewels and weighing 56 ounces, and this was placed in a leather case and sealed. They weren't supposed to sell it. They were just supposed to keep it as the security. And the collar was indeed returned to the king in December 1416, but although the sum had not been completely repaid, and instead they got tallies, chits as it were, on the wool custom in London. The issues from the wool custom were the most profitable source of revenue to the crown. The wool custom was the most profitable source. London was the largest port. So getting chits on, as it were, on the wool custom of London was pretty good security. That Henry was able to raise this extremely large sum, I think probably owes something to the fact that the Archbishop, Henry Chichely, he had two brothers, Robert and William Chichely, and both of these men were prosperous London merchants at the time, which is an interesting interplay of the great mercantile families and the great families of church and state. Now, how did they raise the sum? I think they didn't do it by raising a normal tax. Normally, when Parliament granted a 10th and a 15th, the Londoners paid by dividing the sum up between the 24 wards, and then the alderman was responsible for gathering so much from each ward. They were differently assessed. In this case, it seems that contributions were solicited from individual Londoners, and it's interesting that, again, in November 1416, so that's only, a bit more than a year later, but after the victory at Agnincourt, of course, the Londoners agreed to lend a further 10,000 marks, and this was again collected by these individual assessments. But they didn't get any royal treasure pledged on this occasion. They were just given assignments on the wool custom. But you can notice a sort of gradual lessening of enthusiasm for lending money, which is perhaps not surprising. When the king needed a further loan in 1417, different manner of raising the money was decided upon. And it's interesting to see that gradually people are becoming less enthusiastic, and the king has to pledge again his Spanish sword, which was part of the treasure of Richard II, which had passed to the Lancastrians. It was decorated with jewels and weighed 84 ounces and was valued at £2,000. But as I say, it was becoming harder to raise loans in the city, so I don't think we should think the city was madly enthusiastic for this war. Yes, they will support the king, but even after his victory and his conquest, they weren't very keen to go on lending large sums of money. And there was some protest. There was some resistance to paying tax. Men were threatened with the loss of their freedom, that is their citizenship, if they failed to pay, and 14 men were sent to Newgate for refusing to contribute to the assessed amount. And the final loan was agreed in May 1421 of £2,000. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that in spite of the really remarkable success of his campaigns in France, Henry and his brothers were finding it increasingly difficult to raise cash in London, and they needed this cash to be able to prosecute the war effectively. And in fact, if you look over the pattern as a whole, it looks as if Henry, on an annual basis, actually raised less money in the city than either Henry IV or, oddly enough, than Henry VI. However, he wasn't only dependent, the king, upon the loans which he could raise in London. Corporately, there were individual lenders who lent him money, and I would draw attention to two of them. One was a man called John Hend, who was a draper, and the other was the mercer Richard Whittington. Both men had been significant lenders to Henry IV. They continued to support his son. Hend made 5 loans, but he died in August 1418, and his largest loan was made in June 1415 on the eve of the battle, of the expedition to France. And Whittington, who, as you know, thrice Lord Mayor of London, served his 3rd term as Mayor of London in 1419 to 20. And he died in 1423, just after Henry V, actually. And he lent money to Henry V on 5 occasions to maintain the siege at Harfleur, and he assembled really quite substantial sums, like £1,333, 6 and 8pence, a very large sum for an individual to be able to provide. And, so it's not just the corporate loans, it's individual loans from individual Londoners as well. But although I've emphasized the financial support, and I do think that was important, there is another significant aspect of London support for Henry's campaigns. because without the resources available in London, the king couldn't equip, feed, or transport his armies. And there are surviving numerous proclamations, all written in English, posted in the City of London, urging Londoners to supply goods or to go in person to join the king's army. Because after the capture of Harfleur and the great victory at Agnincourt, there was a continual English presence. It was necessary to maintain the English and extend the English hold on France against increasingly French attacks and attempts to regain it. The Londoners were urged to travel there. This is to help to maintain, in October 1415, so this is on the eve of Agnincourt, after the capture of Harfleur, and the proclamation says there to bring corn, bread, meal or flour, wine, ale or beer, fish, flesh or any victuals, clothes, linen, woolen or any merchandise, shirts, breeches, doublets, hose, shoes, or any manner of armour, artillery, or any other stuff. So what they're saying is bring anything you've got. Our army is desperate for supplies of all kinds. And they were to be ready with their goods within 7 days, and the mayor was to be responsible for providing the transport to take all that material, whatever it was, across to France. And I think it's worth remembering that the transport of these goods depended for its success on the organizational skills of the mayor, who was expected to find the ships and the sailors and to take all the assembled men and equipment across the channel. In the summer of 1418, the men and their foodstuffs due to sail for Normandy were told to assemble at the Church of St. Dunstan in the east, which is, as you know, in the east near the Tower of London, where William Sevenoak, who was the alderman of Tower Ward, and others who were assigned to the task would provide the transport. And on the 10th of August that same year, 1418, the king, who was at the time besieging the great town of Rouen, in his letter specifically asked the mayor, aldermen, commons of London, I quote, in this one of his letters, to arm as many small vessels as ye may, goodly with victuals, and namely with drink, to come to Harfleur, and from there as far as they may, up the river Seine towards Rouen. And in return, the king promised to show them even the better lordship in time coming. The king's letter was received in London, that one, on the 19th of August, and by the 8th of September, so not long afterwards, the Londoners were able to assure the king that they had done our busy diligence, this is their phrase, in loading the vessels with victuals, and these were listed: 30 butts of sweet wine, 1,000 pipes of ale and beer, 2,500 cups for your host to drink of. There's no point in sending beer if they haven't got any cups to drink it out of. And all this they gave to the king. This was to be a gift from the city. He wasn't to pay for it, this was a gift. And so at a meeting, the aldermen decided how they were going to pay for this. And they decided that the brewers who supplied the ale and the beer were to be paid a total of £500. The turners, those are the people who make the wooden cups, were to have 4 shillings for every 100 cups. The rowers who ferried the beer out to the ships anchored in the midstream were to have £8, 11 eightpence. The wine drawers, who took the wine from the cellars down to the harbour, were to have 3d for every ton that they transported. And the carters, who brought goods from further away, were to have 4d for every cart. It's not clear how the money was raised, but the interesting thing is that we do know that the suppliers actually received it, because we have surviving the record book of the Brewers' Company of London. Now, most of the medieval records we have are of the great companies, the mercers, the goldsmiths, merchant tailors, what else? Grocers. But the Brewers' book also says, now the Brewers were a nouveau company. They weren't one of the great companies. They, as you know, ale was the drink of medieval England, but gradually beer made with hops was being introduced, so beer was being brewed on a more commercial scale. So the Brewers' Company were up and coming. They were quite prosperous, and their records survive. We have a record book from the early 15th century, and it contains a detailed account of the costs incurred by the 24 brewers who provided the beer for this, the mayor and all. And it gives an exact account of how much each brewer who supplied money was to be repaid, with a certain small percentage taken off for, as it were, administrative costs. We all know about those. So, and the total outlay of the brewers was £122, which represents a very considerable investment on their part in the royal invasion in France. But And the other interesting thing just to say about the brewers' accounts is that they start their records in Latin, and then their clerk says, but since the king writes to us in English, we're going to keep our accounts in English. And they did. And from then on, the brewers' accounts in English, which shows you the influence of Henry's decision to communicate with the City of London in English. It had a very important effect on the growth of, as it were, administrative English as well. It was a very remarkable, you might say obvious, but it was quite a remarkable thing for the king to have done. Anyway, not only did the Londoners supply beer and ale and wine and so on, they acted as ship's chandlers. They equipped vessels which transported men, armour and food, as we said, across the Channel. In July 1415, for the Agnincourt campaign, John Rainwell, who was an ironmonger and later a future mayor of London, provided a substantial quantity of goods, including masts, to equip the king's flagship, which was called La Trinité Royale de la Tower. And the following year, he supplied oakum and canvas for the Duke of Bedford's ship at Southampton, which was called the Anne. He was married to Anne of Luxembourg, named his ship after his wife. I don't know if that's, well, maybe that's complimentary. Anyway, in 1419, the city decided to grant the king a supply of armed men. Now, this was unusual. The city very rarely actually supplied men to fight. They usually supplied money or foodstuffs or armour, but not usually armed men, but because those would be provided by the great aristocracy who would gather groups of knights and hosts and so on to fight with them. But the city said they would send the king either 500 archers for 3 months or 1,000 archers for 6 weeks. And the costs of these men were to be met by raising a tax in the city. And Henry wrote from Pontoise in France on the 17th of August and thanked the Londoners, I quote, with all our heart for the goodwill and service that we have always found in you hithertoward, and especially for your kind and noble proffer of an aid. The point being is that they were going to give these, and they weren't going to charge him for them. And Henry goes on to say, what a good example the Londoners are providing for the rest of the king's subjects. So the support which the City of London provided for the king was not simply the short-term cash loans, important as these were, but it encompassed supplying and equipping the English troops sent to France and on occasion gathering and paying men to fight. And the frequent proclamations which were posted in the city urging men to support the king's enterprise in France always involved the Mayor of London in collecting and transporting the troops, the armour and the food. So what I'm trying to say is that the logistical help provided by the Londoners must have been of crucial importance, just as important as the financial support. But the Londoners' engagement with Henry V wasn't confined exclusively to his great military enterprise in France. It was also the City of London which provided processions which enhanced the significance of crown events, and these are not all connected with the war in France. For example, Henry V chose to be crowned only 3 weeks after the death of his father in 1413. And the celebrations, perhaps for this reason, because it was so shortly after his father's death, were quite meagre. His coronation took place on the 9th of April, which was Passion Sunday, which is the 5th Sunday in Lent. So being in the middle of Lent, maybe that also explains the muted celebrations. And interestingly, a man called John Cock, who was a brother of the Hospital of St. Bartholomew, the hospital's still there, noted in the cartulary, the great cartulary which he wrote for his hospital, that he was present in London on the day of the king's coronation and witnessed the coronation procession, and he said the day was valde pluviosa, very rainy. And if you remember the coronation of our current queen, it was pretty rainy, and also her Diamond Jubilee was extremely wet, if you remember. Anyway, so Henry V's coronation day, it rained. And Henry rode across London Bridge, which was customary. He was greeted by giants and singers on the bridge and musicians, and we know something about those because they were paid for by the different city companies and recorded in their accounts as he processed through the city. But it wasn't obviously, it was quite a low-key affair. And again, when Henry left for France on his great campaign in June 1415, as he rode through the city of London, he was accompanied by the mayor and aldermen who accompanied him across London Bridge to Blackheath, and then they took leave of the king. And the king, according to a chronicle account, said, the king bade the mayor go home and keep well his chamber, That's what he called it. It was often the royal phrase to call the City of London the King's Chamber, and keep well his chamber in his absence. And he gave him Christ's blessing and his own, and cried, Christ save London. Well, these were anxious days for the city as they waited to hear news of how well the king got on. And as we've seen early in October, there was that proclamation asking for food and supplies to be sent to Harfleur to support the king's army. And then we have an interesting account of how the news of Agnincourt was received in London. Because, again, the account is in the city's letter book, and again, it's probably the work of John Carpenter, and it describes how at first the city received bad news. Now, you know, of course, that Henry left Harfleur and was moving northeast across France, and his army was very depleted. They were not well. They were trying to avoid encountering the great French army, and in fact, they couldn't avoid this, and so they had to stand and fight. And as we know, it all turned out well. But obviously, somebody from that army had come back to London and said, things aren't good, the army's not in good shape, we're being chased by the French. Anyway, so the city first received bad news, actually on the 25th of October, that is St. Crispin's Day, the actual day when the battle was fought, but this was clearly somebody who had come to London, leaving the army a few days earlier, and namely brought a report which caused, I quote, is written in an endless sorrow, and alarmed the community throughout the city. But then, on the 28th of October, so that is 3 days after the Battle of Agnincourt, on the 25th, the, I quote, a trustworthy report of the truth arrived to refresh the longing ears of all the city. That is, that Henry had won the Battle of Agnincourt. So on the following day, the 29th of October, when it was the customary day for the newly elected mayor, who in this case was a draper called Nicholas Wotton, the newly elected mayor would go with the aldermen and ride to Westminster to take his oath, the origin of our Lord Mayor's procession. And on this day it was decided, because of the news of the battle of the victory at Agnincourt, that the mayor and aldermen and an immense number of the commonalty, that is of the citizens, should not ride but to go on foot, as on pilgrimage to Westminster, to give thanks in the abbey for the joyous news, and that they would then take the oath before the barons of the Exchequer. And Carpenter, again, very anxious to point out that this was exceptional and not to be taken as a precedent. He didn't want them to have to go walking every time. Well, the welcome, of course, for Henry V on his return from Agnincourt, although he, which was about a month later, Saturday the 23rd of November was the day in which he was received in the City of London. And of course it was quite elaborate, although the city had only had about 4 weeks to prepare. And we have a very good account of this, written in a chronicle called Gesta Henrici Quinti, The Deeds of Henry V, probably written by a chaplain in the household of Henry V. And the theme of the welcome was not so much triumphalist as reverent and giving thanks to God for Henry's victory. Although on London Bridge there was a giant, quote, to teach Frenchmen courtesy, accompanied by his wife, who was dressed in a red cloak for some reason, together with St. George, a lion, which of course was the badge of England, and an antelope, which was Henry's personal badge. And the costs of these pageants on London Bridge, together with the choirs of boys who were dressed as angels and singing the anthem Benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini, and blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, amounted in all to about £20, which had to be paid for out of the normal income of the bridge. London Bridge, as you probably know, was had its own endowments of land that people gave as a charitable and pious purpose, and was administered by bridge wardens, and they used this money to maintain London Bridge. In fact, there is still a London Bridge account, a great trust, and many of us would like to get our hands on that for things like historical research, but they use it for other purposes. Anyway, the bridge estate was very substantial, but they had to pay for these pageants. And the city companies also contributed to these festivities. The grocers paid for minstrels, I quote, to meet the king at his coming out of France. And apart from the pageants on London Bridge, there was another pageant at the northern end of the bridge at St. Magnus Church. There were three pageants at the Conduit in Cornhill and Cheapside, and a magnificent castle was built around the Cheapside Cross and crammed with boys singing. And then the next day, the Sunday, and the mayor and aldermen and many of the commoners went and visited the king at Westminster and presented him with a gift of £1,000 in 2 gold basins worth £500. The city, of course, recorded the value of these things. So that was the procession and the welcome after Agnincourt. Then 6 months later, in 1416, the Emperor Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, visited London because Henry was anxious to get him as an ally against France, so it was part of his diplomatic drive. And the mayor and aldermen, again, were instructed by the King's Council to go to Blackheath to meet the Emperor and to escort him into London. And the King would meet him in Southwark and bring him over London Bridge to Westminster, where he was lodged, the Emperor, that is. And the city didn't provide pageants or musicians on this occasion, but the mayor had to ensure that peace was maintained in the city in the face of this considerable influx of knights and esquires summoned to London by the king, and, of course, the extensive entourage of the emperor himself. And it was the mayor's responsibility to ensure that there was sufficient food in the city to feed all these people and that the prices remained under control. The mayor, therefore, had that's Nicholas Wotton, had a considerable task on his hands. But the most elaborate arrangements and festivals were for the welcome and coronation of Queen Catherine of Valois. In February 1421, she married Henry in France, and then he brought her to England in February 1421. And there we know quite a bit because there was more time to prepare. The city, the Bridge House accounts tell us that a great deal about what was prepared for her. A new giant was made, and the central figure on the bridge was, of course, not a giant to teach Frenchmen courtesy. That wouldn't be very, wouldn't be very polite. So it was the central figure in the pageant was the figure of St. Petronilla, who is the supposed daughter of St. Peter and is the patroness of the Carolingian kings of France. So that was in tribute to Catherine's French royal connections, of course. And the cost to the bridge on this occasion came to over £80. That was a big bite out of their annual income. And then there were other pageants in the city. The conduit flowed with wine. And on the eve of her coronation, the Queen received a delegation of the Mayor and Aldermen of London, who presented her with a pair of silver basins. Notice her husband had got gold basins, and 1,000 marks. He'd got £1,000. A mark is 2/3 of a pound. And then, they accompanied her through the city to Westminster, and many, again, of the companies contributed to all this. So, a very important aspect of something that the city could do for the crown. But the gaiety and hope which accompanied Catherine's coronation was frustrated, of course, by the death of her husband, Henry V, 18 months later, on the 31st of August, 1422. And again, therefore, the usual festivities that accompanied the mayor's riding to Westminster to take his oath were very muted. The crafts which accompanied the mayor wore only black or russet gowns instead of their usual livery, and they travelled by barge instead of riding. The barge at that time was a cheaper option to riding. When the king's coffin arrived at Southwark on the 5th of November, it took a long time because it processed, the body obviously was embalmed, and it was then processed through his various French territories in northern France, and finally reached London on the 5th of November. He died on the 31st of August, so it had taken some time. The mayor, the sheriffs, aldermen, the members of the Common Council, the men of the crafts, provided the group of 300 mourners who accompanied the royal coffin from Southwark to St. Paul's Cathedral, and on the following day to Westminster Abbey. All the mourners accompanying the coffin wore white gowns which had been paid for by the city chamberlain, but the crafts paid for the torches which their own members held. And it's interesting because it's recorded how many torches different companies. So the mercers, the grocers, drapers, skinners, vintners, fishmongers, and tailors each provided 12 torches. The ironmongers, goldsmiths, saddlers, brewers, butchers, cordwainers, 8 torches. The wax chandlers, tallow chandlers, fletchers, and bowers, acting together, and the pewterers, dyers, and armourers each provided 6 torches. The shearmen, who later became the cloth workers, the salters, girdlers, haberdashers, curriers, barbers, glovers, and founders, 4 each, and the braziers, hatters, painters, and fullers, 3 each. So you can see the sort of hierarchy of the great companies and so on. A total of 211 torches. That's a lot of big torches, like great candles. And we know a little bit. The 12 torches provided by the Mercers' Company cost £5 and 10 pence. and their torchbearers were each provided with ale, so they were kept going while they carried the torch along, costing fourpence, and each man also held a rosary, which the company bought for them, which was quite an interesting touch. The brewers, who supplied 8 torches at a cost of £2.11, provided each torchbearer with food for 2 days at a cost of 6pence for each man. And in every one of the wards through which this catafalque passed, from St Magnus Church, the northern end of London Bridge, to Temple Bar in the west, every householder stood holding a torch in his doorway, and the chaplains of the churches, the chapels which the funeral procession passed, wore their richest vestments and censed the corpse as it passed. And following Henry's death, every year the city crafts, and this is recorded in their accounts, provided men for a barge which went to Westminster for the King's anniversary service. This is unique. No other king had this kind of commemoration in the city, that each year on the anniversary of his death, a barge went and every company contributed to that. And it continued until the Reformation. So what I would conclude and suggest to you is that the 10 mayors of London who held office during Henry's short reign had a very tough assignment. There were 3 mercers, 2 drapers, 1 skinner, 1 ironmonger, 3 grocers. They had to maintain peace in the city during the king's long absences abroad, and that wasn't an easy task in the light of the smouldering Lollard disturbances. They were expected to ensure a supply of loans to the king, to oversee the collection of the money in the city, and then to secure the repayment of those loans. In addition, they might well be expected to make personal loans, as Richard Whittington did so spectacularly. But of equal importance, I think, but not always so visible, was their difficult task of acting as the king's quartermaster, an ordnance corps, collecting and equipping men and ships, and attempting to supply the troops in France with the tools to finish the job. But I would suggest to you that the Londoners' response to the death of Henry V demonstrated that they carried out these tasks not only with their heads, but also with their hearts. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I think I'm sure all of us got a real good sense of what the city was like and its workings back then, and how that worked. I mean, I have some questions, but I'll only give you one.
Right.
We'll open up to the floor now, using the mic. I can get it working. My question is to what extent, I got a sense, to what extent was Henry an absentee king, if we compare, for example, with Richard I?
He was absent a lot.
Right.
Which, I mean, he was away for 3 years at a time when,
Yes.
when he got married to Catherine. So, I mean, I don't mean it took 3 years to get married to Catherine, but I mean, he was away, and that was the culmination after the treaty.
Right.
So I think that was really important, but he had very loyal supporters. I mean, for some reason, he was a man who could attract loyalty amongst, I mean, as Edward III was. You notice that Edward III's sons were very supportive of Edward III's campaigns. And Henry's brothers all supported him. Thomas of Clarence, John, Duke of Bedford, Henry of Gloucester. And after he died, they tried to keep, well, Thomas had died, but tried to keep loyal to his vision of his conquest and his kingship of France. So, you know, I think he was, that is a remarkable achievement, that being absent so much, yet everybody remained loyal and keep facing in the same direction and trying to support his great campaign.
And he was quite a young king, so which makes it
Yes,
more...
I mean, not as young as, I mean, what was he?
Not as young as Richard.
No, he wasn't as young. I mean, he was after all, when he came to the throne, he had 4 children of his own. I mean, he'd been married to Mary Boone, who had died, and sorry, wrong. No, he was not I'm sorry, that's Henry IV. No, he was not married, sorry. But he was, you know, he'd fought at the Battle of Shrewsbury, he'd fought in Wales, you know, he was in his 20s. You know, he was ready for it.
Robin, do you want to be on mic guy?
Yes.
Mr. Warman.
Caroline, do we know anything about Henry IV's relationship with the City of London?
Yes. Terrible, whatever you talk about, somebody wants you to tell them. Henry IV, I mean, it's always suggested that Henry IV was very popular and Richard II was not, and that's certainly the sort of Shakespeare view, isn't it? I personally think that Richard was not as unpopular in the city as later Lancastrian propaganda. After all, the victor always tells the story. So Henry IV tells the story of how, Richard was unpopular and he was the popular king and so on. I think Henry IV got on pretty well with the City of London. He got loans from from Richard Whittington. I mean, interestingly, Richard Whittington lent money to Richard II. He also lent money to Henry IV. I think there was a sort of business head. I think Henry did quite well, but he had a lot of rebellions to deal with. But the City of London, on the whole, got on all right. They lent him money. They supported him. I think the Londoners were pragmatic. They weren't going to fight for Richard II, if he... And in due course, they didn't fight for him. They went with the victor. I mean, that's good business, isn't it, really? So I think Henry IV had a good relationship with the city, a perfectly adequate one, but Henry V had a better one. That's what I would say.
You mentioned the choice that Henry had from the city of 10,000 archers or another alternative. Did he take the archers, and if so, was that critical?
No, it was the choice was the length of time. He either could have chaps for 3 months or for 6 weeks, but I think they were to be archers. Let me see. Right, 500 archers for 3 months or 1,000 archers for 6 weeks.
And do you know which one he took?
Good question.
And was it
the short answer is no, I don't know. I'll see if I can find out. But please don't ask me about campaign, whether the left flank attacked or the right. Not my scene. I just thought I'd better head that one off in case people ask me, what the French cavalry were up to. What I know is based on the Laurence Olivier, really.
Only a little one, but I was really surprised at the speed that the victory at Agnincourt actually reached London.
I know, it is.
Considering that they had to cross the Channel.
25th, 6th, 7th. Yes, I mean, I suppose that by this time they weren't that far from Calais, remember? And, I mean, crossing the Channel takes, well, depends whether, there are French farmers striking or anything. But, I mean, basically, I think they got... I mean, crossing the Channel is what, 4 or 5 hours, I suppose, or depends, and then riding up to London. I mean, if you've got good news like that, you want to be the first because you tend to reward the messenger with good news. So I imagine there was an incentive to do it as quickly as possible.
Waterloo took ages, notoriously.
Did it? Right. Well, I mean, things got worse, didn't they, from the medieval period? Right. Oh, well, they were... Oh, okay.
There's a good book.
Right.
I think it's fascinating, the complexity of loans, gifts, and other sorts of promissories and so on. When he died, did the debts die with him, or have you got any record of the percentages actually repaid?
No, the Exchequer accepted the loans, that had been made, and so your successor had to pay. Though, obviously, if you're a usurper, like Henry IV, he didn't reckon he did have to pay Richard II's debts. But Henry V, Henry VI, or his council in this case, did accept that they had to pay. After all, they needed, some people would do much less well, but the Londoners, the king needed the loans from London, so they were going to probably be the first people to be repaid loans.
So it's a reasonable record that they were repaid.
Yes,
by and large.
The Exchequer records are very interesting to read. They're in rolls, as you probably know, and it records the loan, and then it records on the right-hand side if it was repaid cash, they write sol, or it says they were repaid with tallies. And sometimes, of course, now, this was very cunning, if you were, as Henry VI got more into debt, more in problems, one way of dealing with your financial problems was if people had tallies on the wool custom in the port of Hull and the port of Chichester and the port of London, you just changed one customer, collector of customs in each port, so all the tallies were invalidated, right? So then everybody has to get new tallies in order. So there were ways in which you could prolong or a loan, but that didn't make people happy, and the Londoners on the whole always got assignments on the wool custom or the other customs in London where they had influence and could collect successfully.
They call that rolling over debt these days,
I think
don't
that,
they?
yes, yes.
Thank you.
Caroline, in your assessment of the behaviour of the city towards Henry, or indeed behaviour towards any other monarch, did you deduce any particular sort of sense of ethics or propriety in the way the city looked at the relationship with the monarch, or was it simply based on pragmatism, the right horse to back at any time?
You mean, did they sort of think that an anointed...
Was there a right or a wrong, or was it simply, well, it's money, it's commerce, it's what reflects our best interests, and this is the right one to back at a particular time?
I suspect that the latter, I have to say. I mean, I think they were pragmatic. I think if you look at the Wars of the Roses, you know, members of the aristocracy would side with one side or the other. But the Londoners, well, there's a very nice bit where the Earl of Warwick, people will arrive, and the Londoners send them a message saying, perhaps you'd like to go somewhere else and not come via London. This is the opposition. And of course, the Earl of Warwick is going to come to London, so they sort of let him in. Do you see what I mean? They say, go away and go somewhere else, you know. And when he won't be deflected, they say, okay. And once they'd let in the Yorkists, as in effect, they had to make sure the Yorkists were successful. So then you get massive loans to the Yorkists in that short period before Edward IV is finally successful, becomes king. Because in a sense, if you've let the opposition into the city, you've got to make sure the opposition wins. So in a sense, they'd made an investment. But I don't think it was an emotional... They didn't think this person is more right to be king than that one. They just thought, okay, he's here. And I think actually the government of Henry VI, the council, was not a good government. It was ineffective. And I think that they wanted strong government, which is always better for trade and so on. So I think Edward IV seemed to them probably to present a better opportunity. But I think they would have preferred him to go away and they not have to deal with it. But if they let him in, they had to make sure he was then successful.
Very good. Any more?
I've heard a story that Richard Whittington threw a bill of debt into a fire at a banquet. Is this true? Or is this a myth?
I think my guess of the sort of person I think Richard Whittington was, I think he'd be very unlikely to throw a tally into the fire and burn it. But I think he did lend money to the crown. It was, on the whole, repaid. But what I think was the case with Richard, as you realise, his wife had died, he had no children, so all his great estate went to charitable purposes. So in a sense, myths grew up around him as this great charitable figure. And what is interesting about Whittington, I mean, he's worth a talk in his own right, but just as interesting as Gresham, is in fact that he did something unusual in that he gave his great estate, and he founded almshouses and a college of priests, not to the church, which would have been the normal thing, but he gave it to the Mercers' Company. And of course that meant that when the Reformation came, it didn't get taken away, and so his benefactions, which carried his name, Whittington's Almshouse, Whittington College, survived in a way, and therefore when the story of a cat, I'm afraid there's no historical evidence for the cat, but when the story of a cat bringing fortune, good fortune, which is a European folklore, comes to England in the late 16th century, it is attached to Whittington because his benefactions had kept his name as a great charitable, successful entrepreneur alive for 150, nearly 200 years. So, but he didn't, I think, he didn't make his money by burning tallies. Yeah.
David and then Chris. Do we still have Tracy in the room? No?
No.
Tracy still might have gone. She's our London historians expert on the Whittington legend.
Oh, perhaps she was upset by something I said.
I was going to ask a follow-on on Whittington, and that's, I think you said he gave over £1,000 to the king at one point?
Well, certainly he... but
And did I get that right? That was about twice the king's annual... No. The annual income was about... The king's
annual
twice
is 34,000.
34,000?
Yes.
Okay.
So, but what you have to remember is that these loans were then repaid, so it's money that can be lent out again. Do you see what I mean? Over, you know,
but it still leads
it's
me to wonder, how rich was Whittington to be able to give that amount of money?
Well, when he died, it's thought his estate was worth £5,000 or £6,000.
Right.
Interestingly, his chief executor was John Carpenter, and he had been town clerk or common clerk when Whittington was mayor, and he seems to have been the chief executor, and my guess is that he influenced Whittington because one of the things that Whittington's money went on, apart from the almshouses and the College of Priests, was the library at Guildhall. Yeah. And there's no evidence that Whittington particularly read books or had books. But the person who had a big personal library was Carpenter. And John Carpenter, I think, said to Whittington, "You'd like to have a library, wouldn't you?" And so they set up the first public library near to Guildhall. And Carpenter left, he left his books are all named in, well, not all of them, but he lists a lot of his books and gives them to individual people. But the residue of his books was to go to the Guildhall Library. And then you get other bequests to Guildhall Library. Unfortunately, because the library was quite closely associated with the Guildhall College of Priests, which was deemed the Chantry Act to be a sort of chantry, so it was dissolved in 1548, and the books were taken away in carts by Protector Somerset, and they were never, although the alderman said, "We hope when he's finished reading them he'll return them," he didn't return them. So I have a feeling that there may be books from Guildhall Library in Burley House, you know, where the but so that library, I feel sad about that, because here was a library for public use, nipped in the bud, really. We think of the Reformation as setting up a whole lot of somebody's disagreeing with me here. Setting up a whole lot of... we think of the Reformation with those new professorships at Oxford and Cambridge and this emphasis on learning and reading the Bible and so on. But in some ways, the Reformation destroyed some intellectual enterprises that had been going. So it was, not all good, the Reformation.
Well, one more thing, Chris.
I'm sorry, those that know I'm always bashing on about St Catherine's in the shadow of the Tower of London, but I'm very interested, if I may ask, was it an advantage or a disadvantage that the ancient hospital, by Henry V's time, I think there may well have been 1,500, 2,000 people, which is quite a lot of people at that time, stayed separate from the City of London. They would, as I understand it, every time the city said, we want your taxes and your, it was a very thriving dock, I think, by Henry V's time. They said, no, go away, and if you don't, we'll get the Queen onto you, because the Queen was always the patron. But we hear so little about St Catherine's. I wonder...
Well, I think we know a certain amount. You mean the Hospital of St Catherine that was founded in the 12th century and
yes,
still going
1147, 1825.
Which is just, as you probably all know, just lies to the east of the Tower of London. I don't think there could possibly have been 1,500 people in it. As far as I know, there were 12, there were a few brothers and 12, as many of these hospitals had 12 almspeople living there, and these were women in St Catherine's Hospital, as I understand it. But
I think three were, and three brothers. Oh, anyway, sorry, okay. I mean to interrupt you.
But there's quite a good account you can read in Jameson's book about St Catherine's Hospital, and also in the Victoria County History volume on the City of London, which deals with all the religious houses, published in 1908, has a very good account of St Catherine's Hospital. So if you're interested in it, that's where I would start.
I have read it.
Okay. And it doesn't say 1,500 people were living there, surely.
Well, it doesn't say any, but by 1825 there were
by
4,500.
Oh, sorry, by 18... Yeah, sorry, I thought you meant...
But by Henry V's time, there were a substantial number. That's the guess.
Just the Henry V thing.
Sorry?
Just the Henry V thing.
Do you think... Anyway.
Well, it's only that there are so little in terms of records as to their contribution to these things.
Right. Well, there's always prayer. Henry V, you know, really, really believed that God was on his side. I mean, he really believed that it was St. George and St. Crispin and the patron saints, Edward the Confessor, Edmund, King and Martyr, who had supported him, and he was doing God's work. I really believe that he thought that. And he really insisted, you know, for example, that the feast day of St. Crispin should be celebrated, that St. George's Day should be a double feast. He set up the House of Zion and established that as a centre of prayer, and the Carthusian monastery at Sheen. So he was a very, I mean, he really believed in that he was God's chosen king of France. I mean, we find that perhaps more difficult to accept, but I think it's very apparent. And the fact that when he came to London for the procession, it wasn't triumphalist. It was very much, you know, that this is God's work, and we give thanks to God for this great victory. It's God-given. I'm sure that people in St. Catherine's contributed to that.
I think we'll need to wrap it with that. Once again, please,
can I just say about my map? Oh,
I'm going to do that.
Oh, you were going to? Oh, right.
Caroline Barron, another round of applause for... Thank you for your questions. We have to be out of the building quite quickly, about 1:30. Caroline's got some... That map up there is a Tudor map of London, very popular, I gather. You've got about 8 or 10 or
I only
so.
brought them... I don't want you to think I get any money out of this. You know, I'm not Richard Whittington. The point is that when I last talked about something in the Guildhall Library, there were a number of city guides there, City of London guides, and I had a few maps which I sold, and there were lots of people who wanted them and were very miffed that they couldn't get any. So I have brought these maps. They are a map of Tudor London, and on the back it's got an indication of why we've placed certain buildings where we have. You'll be glad to know St. Catherine's is there in the map, right? And actually, it is quite useful to have it as a wall map, because we originally published it in an atlas, so the map was spread out on 4 different sheets of this big atlas. So now they've been put together as a single map. And I suppose it's quite useful because so little of medieval London survives. It's very hard sometimes to have a sense of what the medieval city was like. When you think there was the Reformation, there was the Great Fire, there was the Victorian redevelopment, there was the bombing of the Second World War. When you go to a town like York or Norwich, there's quite a lot of, or indeed continent, it's very little of medieval London left. So this map has been constructed by using written records, but also for the archaeologists who found the remains of buildings. And I'm sure that it can be improved on, but I think it's quite helpful. And just think how small medieval London was. It was the largest city in medieval England. It probably had, at this period, a population of perhaps 40 to 50,000 people. And that map is half of 1 page of a current A to Z of London. It just shows you how vastly London has expanded. I mean, and yet, you know, that was, and there were fields all around, or not so much on the west towards Westminster, but on the east, John Stowe records going out beyond Aldgate and getting milk from the cows. So, you know, it's worth remembering the physicality of the medieval city, that people knew each other. I used to take my students walking around the line of the walls, which we could do in a couple of hours, to remind people that, you know, they knew each other. Your reputation would be known in the city, and therefore it was quite a small community. And some of the things that we find, you know, the sort of punishments were about your public persona and how you perceived, and if you cheated people and so on, you were publicly shamed. So I just think the size of the city and the buildings, and it shows you how important the religious houses were, 30 of them or so, in the city at this time. So it all went at the Reformation. Well, they were transformed, of course, some of them into other purposes. So anyway, if you want the map, I'm sorry, I've got some copies, and it's £7, but it doesn't go to me, it goes to the Historic Towns Atlas Trust, just in case you thought I was making a profit on it.
Okay. Afterwards, we'll be popping across the road to the Sir Christopher Hatton, another Lord Mayor of London, I believe, for drinks. Would we have time to join us?
If I can, I will.
Okay.
Yes, I'd love to.
Could I ask you to return all your glasses to the headmaster's office before you leave? But finally, and sorry, did you have? Okay. Finally, importantly, I'd like to invite applause of thanks for the Gresham folks who aren't here, but Sue did the drinks and all that sort of stuff. Maybe she'll go. Jane and Robin for invaluable help.
Oh, yes.
Finally, last year when Aid Tinniswood did the talk, we gave him a Gresham tie like this one, which I'm not sure we can really. It's not the type of thing you go down very well. So
I haven't worn a tie since I was a sixth former.
Well,
where were we allowed to wear them when I was a sixth?
Instead of that, we've brought you as a thank you a similar sort of thing you'll discover.
Thank you.
As a
Thank you very much
for your fantastic talk.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you
very much.
Okay.